Open up to Matthew 5. Matthew 5, Jesus is in the midst of some very practical teaching here in the Sermon on the Mount. He begins with the keys to happiness. We call them the Beatitudes in verses 3 to 12. He then explained the expectations of disciples who are salt and light. It's not be salt or light. You are salt or light, so be light and be salty is essentially his message in verses 13 to 16. And then he explains that he didn't come to destroy the law, but rather to fulfill it in verses 17 to 20. And then he gives some insight into the law. He speaks of, he's giving, remember we talked about how there's the letter of the law, and then there is the spirit of the law. The letter of the law is, the Bible says, thou shalt not murder. Okay, the letter of the law, but he gives the spirit of the law, which is also that hatred in your heart is the same as murder in verses 21 and 22. And then last week we looked at in verses 23 to 26 the need to deal with offenses immediately and completely. Don't mess around with a brother who's offended. Deal with it. Deal with it quickly. Deal with it completely, and then serve the Lord. And this evening Jesus is going to give a view of purity that was surprising in his day, and it's certainly considered radical in ours. It should be considered radical in any day, because Jesus is going to be deliberately over the top in these verses that we're going to look at this evening. And we start off in verse 27 with the lustful look. He says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery." Now we're going to stop right there. Them of old time. Well, the command to not commit adultery is found in Exodus 20:14 and Deuteronomy 5:18. It's the seventh commandment. Obviously, the first four, remember, deal with man to God. The last six deal with man to other men. This is one of those. And so Jesus is explaining not only the letter, but also the spirit of the seventh commandment. Now, once again, just as it was in verses 21 and 22 when he was talking about hatred being the same as murder, it's not that Jesus is not saying that the law of God given through Moses was insufficient. It certainly wasn't. But what had happened was the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, in the Old Testament, in the intertestamental period especially is when it started in earnest, but then into the New Testament, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were guilty of overcomplicating and also oversimplifying. You see, here's how they were making it overcomplicated. God gave Moses 613 commands. And they took the 613 commands that God gave, and that's, to use a very poor grammar, that's not nothing, is it? 613 commands, that's a lot of do's and don'ts. But they took the 613 commands of the law and they added to it 12 volumes called the Mishnah. Remember, we've talked about this. The Mishnah is the traditions, all of the ridiculous traditions about you can't pass something from one hand to the other on the Sabbath day because that's bearing a burden. You can't pull a chair across the floor because you might put a furrow in the dust and that's plowing. Okay, 12 volumes of that they added to the law of God. So they overcomplicated that. And at the same time, they oversimplified some things. So you take, for instance, the issue of murder, verse 21, or adultery in verse 27. And they narrowed adultery down to be only the actual physical act of adultery. Okay? That's it. Anything short of that, you're good. Don't worry about it. Okay? When it comes to murder, it's the actual, you have to take the knife, you have to stick it in so that the person dies. Otherwise, you haven't committed murder. You're not guilty of that. So they overcomplicated the law of God by adding all of their nonsense. And then they took the law that God did give and they boiled it down so that it was something they felt like, I'm good. I haven't committed adultery because I haven't actually committed the act. I'm not guilty of murder because I haven't committed the act. And so Jesus told them in verses 21 and 22, to hate your brother in your heart without cause is the same as murder. Jesus is going to expand here on what exactly is adultery. He's going to give, again, the spirit of the law. Verse 28. So let me read verse 27, then 28, because I want you to catch the connection here. He says, Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Just as hateful thought is equated with murder, the lustful one is equated with adultery. But I want you to notice those first 5 words of verse 28, but I say unto you, that's significant. Okay? It's kind of a nod to the deity of Christ. Because Jesus is saying, you know what the law says, you know what Moses said, now listen to me. Okay? If I were to stand up and do that, I'd be out of line. But Jesus isn't. Jesus is the one who gave the law, and so Jesus is permitted to expand upon or explain the law however he sees fit. So we should pick up on that. Jesus is making himself an expert on the law that should be heeded above and beyond the elders of years gone by, including Moses. Which, if you'll remember, one of the accusations that was brought against Christ by the religious leaders was, this man claims to be greater than Moses. You remember that? He also claimed to be greater than Abraham. And they took offense at that. But that's exactly what Jesus is doing right here. And then he gets to kind of the meat of what he's saying. Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her. The word looketh, it's the Greek word blepo. It means to see, to discern. It has the idea of with your eyes. Okay, so your physical eyes is, again, we're being very practical here. Jesus says, if you use your eyes to look on a woman to lust, this isn't speaking, this isn't speaking of an inadvertent glance or glimpse. This isn't talking about the unintentional sighting of something that's impure. Okay, that's not what this is. This is talking about the deliberate gaze or the second look. Depending on where you go, and if you ever make it to New York City, I would recommend trying to get out as quickly as you can. But should you end up in New York City and you go to Times Square, Times Square is something to see if you've never been there. It's if you ever see it on TV, it's just a bustling place, and there's all sorts of billboards, and most of them at this point are electronic, and so they're changing all the time. And while they might miss the censor's definition of pornographic, they don't miss God's definition of it. And as if you go through Times Square, you could be looking at a very innocuous billboard, and all of a sudden it switches. And that's not what this is talking about. When we recoil from it, we say, okay, I'm not going to look at that. It's the second look. It's I know I shouldn't see that, but when I do this, that's what this is talking about. The deliberate. Some things we can't help. You will at times have things in your life. If you live in the world today, there will be times when you'll walk past, even if you're being as careful as you should be. You can't avoid the magazine stands. You can't avoid all of the exposure, all of the filth that the world pours on us. But you can, and you must, and you should avoid the deliberate gaze, because that's what Jesus is talking about. 2 Samuel 11, verse 2. I think it's on your handout. Yeah, right there under letter B. This is David in 2 Samuel 11. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed. There's one problem right there. Why is David getting up at eventide? Okay? He was being lazy. He shouldn't have been in Jerusalem at all. He shouldn't have been in bed till the evening, we could make the case. But he arose from off his bed, and he walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. Okay? David's palace was on the hilltop. There was nothing immoral or sinful about David walking on his rooftop. There was nothing immoral or unethical or sinful about David looking around on his rooftop. I'm sure he did frequently when he was home. And that he saw Bathsheba down there was not, he couldn't have known. But what's the problem? He didn't just see her. It says, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Okay? So it went from up to the second look. He went across this boundary, and you know what happened in the case of David. What started here, what started with a look, ended in an immoral place. It ended with him actually committing the sin of adultery. To lust after. The word, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, means to desire, to seek that which is forbidden. Something about knowing that we shouldn't have it makes us want it. Okay, that starts when we're very little. Okay, and it can be with a little child. I've used the illustration when you tell a child don't touch the light socket, where they're surrounded by hundreds of dollars worth of toys and they're not interested. Their consuming passion in life is, I want to touch that, and the only reason is because mom said don't. There's something about it that makes us want it. That's what this is. Whoso looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already in his heart. There's an unbreakable link between the eyes and the heart. Now, obviously, when the Bible speaks about the heart, it's not talking about the blood-pumping organ. It's talking about the mind. The eyes and the mind, or the heart of man, are inextricably linked. In describing the unjust who will come under the judgment of God, Peter said in 2 Peter 2:14, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin. And if you were to go on and read the rest of 2 Peter 2, you would find that what was going on in the eyes was affecting the heart, which was affecting the actions. Because not only out of the abundance of the heart does the mouth speak, but out of the abundance of the heart, the hands move, the mouth moves. Everything is affected by what we allow in. In looking at the destruction of the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah said in Lamentations 3, mine eye affecteth my heart. What you see affects your heart. It affects your walk with the Lord. All actions begin in the heart or the mind before they ever find fulfillment in the body. Every murder that has ever taken place took place first in the mind of the murderer before it took place with the hand. It always happens that way. And the man who looks with the intent of stimulating his lust has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Proverbs 4:23, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Watch out for what you allow in through your eyes, in through your ears, because it affects your heart. This man, it says, has committed adultery with her already. It means he has done it now. When he's looked to lust, he's already done it in his heart. Now, God designed man and woman and the functions of both. And God intended for the sexual desires to be fulfilled within the bonds of marriage. In Hebrews 13:4, the writer of Hebrews said, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. So God has a way. God made man, God made woman. God didn't make a mistake when he made them the way that he made them. But God intended for them to seek the fulfillment of themselves only within his guidelines, only within his boundaries. But the world has always been producing shortcuts and ways to fulfill the desires of the flesh outside of the will of God. And this has probably never been more true than it is in 2022. Probably never. There's never been more access to impurity than in our lifetime. If you think about the access that we have, whether we want it or not, what is pushed on us is unprecedented in human history. Pornographic pictures, movies, books, magazines. Also, by the way, as we look at this and as we talk about this, this is one of those topics where men usually get hounded. And we should, but it's not a uniquely male problem. The intake of female usage of pornography is steadily rising. It's a problem all across the board. Impurity affects everyone. And if God says that if a man looks at a woman to lust, then it's the same sin for a woman to look at a man to lust. It's the same sin to allow in those things that bring on those impure thoughts. Ephesians 5:3 says, "But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks." God says, only within the bounds of marriage. Anything else is wrong. So this is a devastating problem with a monumental price tag. And all of us, if we're honest, would have to admit the world that we live in is filled with this nonsense. It's amazing how much, if like I said, if you're doing everything that you can and you just have to go to Walmart, you're going to be confronted with it. If you turn on the TV and I'm watching the news, it's time to watch the news, and you're watching the news, you're going to be confronted with it. If you get online and you go on social media, you say, all of my friends, I know all of them, they're all Christians. You're going to get ads for nonsense and filth and smut that the world would push off on you. So what can we do in light of this? Well, Jesus advocates for some extreme measures here. Jesus says here in verse 29, "And if thy right hand offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell." What on earth is Jesus advocating here? Is Jesus teaching the mutilation of the body for the preservation of the soul? Because at first glance, that's what it looks like, isn't it? And we believe that when we are reading Scripture that we should interpret it literally, right? And so as we look at this, if your eyes cause you to stumble, then pull them out. And you look at what this means. To offend means it's the Greek word scandalizo. It means to cause to sin. That means the trigger in a trap. That's what this is. If your eyes serve as the trigger in the trap, if that's the thing where your eyes are something that are difficult for you to contain, and they are what sets off the sin, then pluck it out. You say, well, surely there's some sort of a loophole in that. The pluck it out means to tear out or to root out. So not much of a loophole there, is it? The hand that serves as a trap, he says, cut it off. It means to chop down. And to cast it from thee, the word balo, meaning to violently hurl, used of the hand and the eye. If these are causing a problem, then get rid of them. But obviously, Jesus is speaking figuratively here. Otherwise, we'd all be blind and we'd all have our hands gone, wouldn't we? Because you've sinned with your eyes before, and you've sinned with your hands before, you've sinned with your mouth. We've all sinned. We're all made of flesh. What should we do? You say, I can't help it. Everywhere I turn, there's impurity. My eyes just take it in. He says to remove them, because it's profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. Men have long been willing to part with limbs for the saving of the body. If you look into old times, especially in the Civil War, or in any war really, but the Civil War especially, guys would get shot in the arm, and it wasn't that bad of a wound, but what would happen is infection would set in, and shortly you'd have gangrene. And the doctors would come in and they'd say, look, I know it wasn't that bad when it started, but if you hang on to the arm, you'll die. Because there's infection, it's setting in, it's starting to travel, we have to take the arm. And the man would very willingly, because he wants to live, he'd say, Doc, take the arm so I'll live. Because it's better for me to lose an arm than for my whole body to go into the grave. I can get rid of the arm if it will save my life. That's exactly what this is. What is thought of as an extreme amputation is necessary to live. The phrase cast into hell is the same as what we looked at before here in Matthew 5. It's the word Gehenna. It's talking about the valley of Hinnom, which is the southern valley of the, right below Jerusalem, the southern valley. It's the trash dump. Okay? Always smoke rising out, all sorts of uncleanness. When you had the corpse of something that had died on its own, you fling it out into Gehenna. That's what he's talking about here. It would be better for you to lose the hand, it would be better for you to lose the eye than for your whole body to end up in the trash dump. What is Jesus saying? Well, Jesus is advocating extreme measures to be taken, if necessary, to preserve and maintain purity. He's not teaching that we should rip our eyes out and cut our hands off, but he's saying, look, hey, get serious about it. This is how serious we should be. Get so serious that you're willing to get drastic. You say, well, I have to watch this. No, you really don't. And it would be better for you to not watch it than it would be for you to sacrifice your relationship with God. Well, I have to read this. No, you don't. Neither do I. You have to maintain your relationship with the Lord. And by drastic measures, if necessary. Removing my hands and my eyes to prevent lust is extreme. But what outside of the box measures are you willing to take to preserve purity? Men and women. This is not just a male problem. Accountability. You willing to have accountability with someone? Refusal to read some books, magazines, or articles. You say, oh, I really like, well, but you don't need that. What you need is a relationship with the Lord. Would you be willing to sacrifice it? Jesus says, be willing to chop off your hand. And he's speaking figuratively, but he's being extreme so that we'll understand how important it is. He's using over-the-top language so we'll understand how important it is. F.B. Meyer was a commentator. He was a preacher of years gone by, and I was reading in one of his commentaries, he was talking about a woman had come up and she had told him about this particular novel that she was reading. She recommended it to him, and so he bought the novel and took it on holiday with him, and he was at the beach and he was reading this book. And he said, in the account that he was giving, he said, I got to page 50 before I threw it out into the ocean, because I figured it wouldn't be as bad for the fish as it would have been for me to keep going. Okay? What's he talking about? Well, he could have kept that. He could have gone on with it. No, he didn't need the book. What he needed was his purity. What he needed was his relationship with the Lord. Be aware, in the day and age in which we live, you don't need to go some places. I mentioned Times Square. Don't go there. It used to be that the billboards were paper, and they were considerably more tame than they are now. Now, I wouldn't recommend going there. Why? Well, because you're going to see something that you don't need to see, and it's not necessary to be there in the beginning. Understand, just in the way of being very practical, channel surfing is dangerous. Okay? You might come across things that would spoil purity. There are certain places that you ought to avoid, if at all possible. I love books. I love books and buy lots and lots of books over the course of a year. You know, there are certain books and certain bookstores that I won't go into. And the reason why is there's too much garbage in there. I don't need that. There are certain parts of bookstores. I'd love to see what's on that side, but if I go down that aisle, I got all that garbage behind me, and I'm not going to go down there. The book section in certain stores that's right next to the magazine section, I don't need that, so I'm not going to put I'm going for a good purpose, but I don't need the nonsense. I don't need that. I gave you the illustration, I think, before. A friend of mine and I in college, for a little while, I would give him my glasses, which made everything blurry, and without my glasses, everything was blurry. So when we went into it was the Walmart. They had a pretty rugged front end of the Walmart. So everything was blurry for him. Everything was blurry for me until we got back into the store, and then he'd give me my glasses back. Take drastic measures. Look for opportunities to not be where that is. It would be better to not have a phone, a TV, a computer, to shop at that store, to go down that aisle, than for you to have to do these things and sacrifice purity for your walk with the Lord. Be drastic. Do whatever it takes. It's said that in Northern Europe, and I don't know because I've never seen this, so I can't confirm it with personal experience, but it's said that in Northern Europe there's a small weasel-like animal called the ermine. The ermine has a snow-white coat. Beautiful little animal, like I said, kind of like a weasel or a ferret. And they use it. You can buy an ermine coat, and they're very, very pretty to look at. But rather than snaring these animals, because then they can bloodstain their coat, rather than snaring these animals, what hunters will do, they hunt them during the wintertime often, but even any time of year, they'll take a bucket of grease and they'll wipe it around the hole of this ermine. And then they'll let their dogs loose. And the dogs will chase it, and obviously it runs towards home. But when the ermine gets to its burrow, to its hole, and it sees that it would have to dirty its coat to get safety, it won't cross the line of grease because it would get on its coat. And so the ermine will rather allow itself to be caught and turned into a fancy coat than spoil its coat by crossing a line of grease. That's the idea. How serious are you and I about purity? How serious are you? Jesus has this. Jesus is calling his disciples to be willing to go to extreme lengths in their pursuit of purity. Extreme lengths. Which is interesting because if you look back at verse 8, it says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." What's that relationship with God worth to? It should be worth the sacrifice of going to a certain place, or of shopping in a certain location, or of watching whatever it is, or reading whatever it is. It should be that important to us. We should maintain our purity at extreme cost to ourselves if necessary, because the Lord Jesus Christ gave extreme sacrifice to purchase that salvation and that fellowship that we can